Ancient Rome, a majestic empire that gave the world law, architecture, and roads. It is associated with philosophers, engineers, military leaders, and grandiose buildings. But behind the glitter of gold and the power of the legions, there was a dark side, a world of grueling labor and unbearable suffering. Thousands, even millions of people were chained up or tied to the most difficult tasks, day after day facing conditions that would make a modern person feel sick. Many of them did not choose their fate, but were forced to perform jobs that today would be called real torture. How could people survive such inhumane working conditions, where every day was a struggle for survival? The answer lies in a system that valued work far above human life. But what if I told you that even in this abyss of suffering, there were sometimes sparks of forbidden love and tenderness that could even for a moment illuminate the hopelessness of a slave's life? Are you ready to take a peek into the darkest corners of Roman working life and find out what it was like to teeter on the edge of survival every day while doing 10 of the most brutal jobs in ancient Rome? These facts will turn your idea of the greatness of Rome upside down, showing that behind the great achievements were the unthinkable sufferings of millions. Slave labor in the ancient Roman mines was one of the most terrible parts. These machines for grinding human lives provided the empire with metals, the basis of its wealth, weapons, and infrastructure. Slaves, often prisoners of war or convicted criminals ad metallum, were sent to places like Rio Tinto in Spain or the gold mines in Dacia, with no hope of return. Their status was lower than that of other slaves due to the extreme danger and severity of labor. The work was carried out in narrow, dark tunnels, where the slaves moved crouched or crawling in the dim light of lamps. The air was thick with silicosis causing dust. The temperature could reach 40–50 degrees Celsius, and the humidity was unbearable. The slaves worked for 10 to 12 hours, or even more, without interruptions, under the supervision of cruel overseers. They hollowed out the ore with primitive picks and shovels, then carried it to the surface in heavy baskets on slippery ladders. The death rate among the miners was catastrophic. Many died from landslides, gas poisoning, exhaustion, illness, and injuries. The average life expectancy was only a few years, sometimes months. Archaeological finds of skeletons confirm these horrifying conditions. Accidents, falling rocks, collapses, flooding were commonplace. Being sent to the mines was actually a slow death penalty. The Romans used slaves as an expendable resource for the prosperity of their empire. Roman Colosseum, a magnificent structure that became a symbol of the power and entertainment of the Roman Empire. Its huge arches and tiers could accommodate up to 50,000 spectators eager for bloody spectacles. But there was an entire industry of death behind every grand show staged in his arena, and its main victims were gladiators. They were not accidentally called food for the arena or swords that fight. Most gladiators were slaves captured during countless wars, criminals condemned to death, damnatio ad bestias, to the beasts, or ad gladium, to the sword, or those who received the sentence ad ludum, to games, for serious offenses, which meant training and training. Performance in the arena. They did not choose this fate. They were forced to fight to the death for the entertainment of a crowd of thousands who were hungry for blood and spectacle. It was not just a job, but a constant balancing act on the edge of life and death, where every fight could be the last. What was more terrible for a gladiator? An instant but noble death in the arena, or the unbearable expectation of this death in constant fear, training, and humiliation? And how, even in this world of violence, could deep, forbidden attachments arise? A gladiator's life began in a gladiatorial school, or ludus, such as the famous Ludus Magnus in Rome, located directly next to the Colosseum, connected to it by an underground passage. Here they were subjected to the harshest and most grueling training under the guidance of lanista, a man who was usually a former gladiator or an experienced soldier who taught them the art of combat and survival. Training sessions were extremely intense, aimed at developing strength, endurance, and skills in various weapons appropriate to their type of gladiator: Myrmian, Retiarius, Thracian, etc. Ludus discipline was ironclad, and punishments for the slightest offense or lack of diligence were unbearably harsh, including corporal punishment, food and water deprivation. Gladiators were fed a special diet, which, contrary to popular belief, was often vegetarian, based on barley, legumes, and oatmeal. This barley diet was explained by the fact that such food helped build up a significant layer of subcutaneous fat, which could provide some protection from superficial cuts and blows without affecting vital organs, prolonging the fight and making it more spectacular. However, their lives were full of deprivation, pain, constant fear, and humiliation. They lived in cramped, stuffy barracks, locked up like cattle, without the slightest freedom or choice, waiting for the next entrance to the arena. Why, even in this hell, did gladiators seek solace in intimacy? And what happened if their secret connections were revealed? The answer, like Rome itself, will be merciless. Watch this video to the end. Death was a common and expected outcome for many participants in such spectacles, and blood often drenched the arena sand. Sometimes the fate of the loser was decided by the crowd itself, showing a thumbs down, pollis verso, which meant immediate execution with a sword or dagger. Even winning a battle did not guarantee a gladiator's freedom. He had to fight dozens of times before he could earn his will, and there were very few such cases. The short, torturous life, intended only for the bloody entertainment of the crowd, made this work one of the most inhumane and cruel in ancient Rome. Many gladiators, especially those who did not have outstanding fighting skills or were simply unlucky, spent their short lives in constant fear, knowing that sooner or later they would become another victim on the bloody sand of the amphitheater, and their death would only be another entertainment for the crowd. To find yourself in the position of a galley slave in ancient Rome meant plunging into a world of endless suffering, where every stroke of an oar brought a person closer to certain death. The life of a galley slave consisted of monotonous, exhausting movements, without end and end, in conditions of complete physical and moral exhaustion. The man was chained to his bench, the sun was burning or the storm was raging mercilessly, and all around him was an unbearable stench of sweat, human excrement, rotting water, rats, and overwhelming fear. Galleys were the main types of military and large merchant vessels that were vital for maintaining communications and trade in the vast empire, and their movement was entirely dependent on hundreds of human forces rowing in sync. Galley slaves were most often prisoners of war captured as a result of conflicts, criminals convicted of serious crimes to hard labor, or slaves who were punished for serious offenses on the part of their masters. For them, it was one of the worst sentences, in fact, a slow death penalty on the water from which there was no escape. Why did no one rebel en masse against this terrible fate if there were so many of them on every ship? The answer lies in the most severe discipline and hopelessness. The galley slave's workplace is a narrow, rigid wooden bench to which he was chained by the leg, unable to stand up, straighten up, or even move fully. The days and nights merged into an endless series of repetitive strokes, often accompanied by the rhythmic beating of a drum that set the pace, or the whistle of an overseer who was ready to punish for the slightest delay. During combat operations or long marches at sea, rowing could continue without stopping for 20 hours, and sometimes even more, until complete exhaustion. The food was meager and extremely primitive, usually crackers, porridge made from beans or millet, and a little musty water, barely enough to support life under such enormous physical exertion. Only a few hours of rest were allowed, and sleep was spent right on his own bench, surrounded by his own excrement and vomit, surrounded by equally exhausted companions in misfortune. Rest was only an illusion, as the body was constantly aching and the mind was filled with fear. Hygiene on the galleys was completely absent. People lived in constant filth, dampness, and unsanitary conditions, which led to massive epidemics: scurvy, due to a lack of vitamin C, dysentery, typhoid fever, cholera, as well as numerous skin infections and parasitic infections. Wounds, calluses, and sores caused by the constant friction of chains, wooden oars, and hard benches quickly became infected and festered, turning into deadly threats. The overseers, called centurio, or simply overseers, severely punished those who slowed down, collapsed from exhaustion, or lost their rhythm using whips, sticks, and leather belts. Death on a galley was a frequent occurrence. From complete exhaustion, starvation, dehydration, disease, as well as from direct violence on the part of the overseers or as a result of naval battles. The bodies of the dead were simply thrown overboard without any ceremony, saving space and time. Sometimes the slaves, driven to utter despair, deliberately caused themselves to become ill or tried to commit suicide by throwing themselves into the sea or trying to poison themselves to avoid this torment. Such a life was not just difficult, but an unbearable torment that deprived a person of all dignity, turned him into a living mechanism, and drove him to the extreme degree of physical and moral despair. But what chance was there for a galley slave to be saved, even if it was the most desperate, unthinkable way? And what did Rome do with those who still tried to break out of these shackles? You will find out the answer in the next part. Roman architectural achievements are a miracle of the ancient world. Aqueducts, roads, amphitheaters, temples that still stand today. But behind each majestic structure was a titanic, often deadly labor of builders. Most of these workers were slaves or simple plebeians who had no choice but to engage in manual labor. Construction in ancient Rome is not just masonry, it was one of the most dangerous and cruel professions of that time. Why couldn't the Romans, who were known for their ingenuity, ease the labor of these people, if only for their own good? The answer lies in several factors, primarily in the economic system based on slave labor. With an abundance of cheap labor, there was no incentive to invest in mechanization or better working conditions. Slaves were expendable. Their lives were valued far less than the cost of developing and implementing technologies that could replace manual labor. The Romans were pragmatists, and if a problem could be solved by human power, even at the cost of unbearable suffering, they chose this path. The lack of ethical considerations in relation to slaves and the lower strata of society also played a key role. The human dignity of these people was not taken into account. Workers hand-hauled and lifted huge multi-ton blocks of stone and marble slabs, using primitive winches, ropes, and ramps powered by the muscular strength of hundreds of people. The work was carried out under the scorching sun or heavy rains, without any mechanization, only with the use of levers and human power. The construction of aqueducts required work at high altitudes, where falling meant certain death. During the construction of buildings, workers were at risk of being crushed by falling rocks, collapsed scaffolding, or accidentally dropped tools. Technologies that could make work much easier, such as complex lifting mechanisms, were known, but they were rarely used for large-scale projects where the maximum number of workers was required. The working conditions were primitive. No protective equipment, poor safety standards, poor nutrition, and a grueling schedule. Injuries, fractures, dislocations, shattered limbs were common. Diseases caused by hard work and poor living conditions, such as arthritis, hernias, and infections, quickly turned workers into disabled people. The overseers showed no mercy. Anyone who slowed down or showed signs of weakness was subjected to corporal punishment. The construction of Roman roads that stretched for thousands of kilometers was also unbearably difficult. Digging trenches, laying layers of stone, grinding gravel, all this was done manually under the scorching sun. The life of a construction worker in ancient Rome was short and full of suffering, and their bodies literally became part of the structures they built. Moreover, the organization of labor on large Roman construction sites was hierarchical and authoritarian. The slaves and lower classes were controlled by foremen and overseers who had the right to apply any measures to maintain the pace of work. Accidents and deaths were commonplace and were seen as an unavoidable part of the process. Instead of investing in security, the owners preferred to simply replace the dead or injured workers with new ones. This system was brutal but cost-effective and allowed Rome to build its monumental structures with surprising speed. Roman engineering thought was focused on achieving a goal, not on humanity. The genius of the Romans was not to make labor easier, but to exploit it as much as possible. But why, even in this hell of construction sites, did the slaves not give up and sometimes find ways to take revenge on their tormentors? Find out how they did it in the next part. The Romans were known for their cleanliness, but who provided that cleanliness? This dirty and humiliating work was performed by foulons, or washerwomen, who were often slaves or the poorest free people. Working in a falonica, laundry, was one of the most disgusting and violent jobs in ancient Rome. Fuloniki were huge complexes with numerous stone pools and devices for processing fabrics. What was her particular cruelty, and why was it shunned by everyone who could? The main feature of Fulon's work was the use of human urine as the main detergent. Urine containing ammonia was an effective alkaline solution that could break down grease and dirt on clothing. Workers soaked dirty cloths in large vats of urine and then literally trampled them underfoot to knock out the dirt. This process, known as fulling, was incredibly dirty, smelly, and humiliating. Fulons were soaked for hours in a pungent, fetid liquid that caused skin irritations, ulcers, and other skin diseases. In addition, the risk of infection through open wounds on the legs was extremely high. In addition, fulons were also used to bleach fabrics using sulfur, which was burned under clothing in special chambers. The sulfur fumes were pungent and toxic, causing breathing and eye problems. Continuous inhalation of sulfur dioxide led to chronic lung diseases, asthma, and other respiratory problems, significantly reducing the life expectancy of workers. After washing and bleaching, the fabrics had to be thoroughly dried and pressed, which required physical strength in constant standing. Constant contact with urine, chemicals, and dirt led to chronic diseases of the feet and skin, as well as a constant unpleasant smell that permeated the clothes and bodies of the fulons, making them outcasts in society. Even for a slave, it was one of the most miserable and despicable jobs that had to be performed in conditions of constant stench and physical discomfort. Collecting urine was also part of their duties. In Rome, there were special vessels installed in the streets where citizens relieved themselves, and the fulons regularly emptied them. The process itself was humiliating and messy. The social stigma attached to this profession was enormous. Fulons were considered the lowest of the low, despised and shunned because of their smell and association with sewage. They were often forbidden to visit public baths or be in places where noble citizens congregated. This profession, despite its vital necessity for the hygiene of the city, was a symbol of extreme humiliation and rejection. Fulon's life was not only physically difficult and dangerous, but also psychologically devastating due to constant social ostracism. But what happened if, even in this hell of smells and humiliations, the slaves found solace in each other? And how did Roman society react to any expressions of humanity among them? The answer will surprise you if you watch this video to the end. If in ancient Rome there was a job that could compete for the title of the dirtiest and most disgusting, then it was the profession of a sewer cleaner, or cloacarius. These men were responsible for cleaning the famous Roman sewage systems, including the Great Cloaca Maxima, which was one of the most impressive engineering systems in the ancient world. Their work was vital to maintaining hygiene in a city of millions, but the conditions in which they worked were unimaginably harsh. Why was this profession of keeping the city clean so deadly in itself? Cloacaries spent their days and sometimes nights in dark, fetid, and dangerous underground tunnels, where all the filth of the vast city circulated. They had to manually remove the congestion caused by garbage, waste, and silt. Working in confined spaces filled with methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other toxic gases was extremely dangerous, and often resulted in poisoning and death by suffocation. Accidents were commonplace. Workers could fall into sewage, drown, or be crushed by collapsed silt tunnel arches. The lack of ventilation and lighting added to these risks, turning every shift into a survival lottery. Constant contact with excrement, rotting waste, and sewage led to numerous infectious diseases: dysentery, typhoid fever, skin infections, parasitic infections. Unsanitary conditions and a lack of basic hygiene after work made their bodies and clothes a hotbed of disease and a source of unbearable smell. These people were social outcasts who were shunned by everyone who could. Their work was invisible and despised, but without them, the city would simply be drowning in its own waste. The cloacaries' life was short, filled with disease and despair, and their bodies, steeped in the stench, as well as the cloaca itself, were hidden from the eyes of most Romans. In addition to the immediate dangers of gases and infections, cloacaries were constantly faced with psychological pressure and disgust. Working in constant darkness, in the midst of filth, in conditions that most people would find unbearable, left a deep imprint on their psyche. They were condemned to a life of isolation, rejected by a society that enjoyed the fruits of their labor, but despised those who performed it. The lack of any protection or compensation for their dangerous and disgusting labor emphasized their low status in Roman society. Their existence was a testament to how far the Romans were willing to go in exploiting human labor for the sake of maintaining their civilization and the comfort of the upper strata of the population. Can you imagine a more humiliating and dangerous fate than living in the eternal stench, literally immersed in the waste of someone else's life? And how, in the face of such hopelessness, could the slaves have had any hope? And what did they do to make their fate any easier? Keep watching for more shocking details. The Romans loved bread, which was the mainstay of their diet. Almost every day they consumed a huge amount of bread, and for its production there were special bakeries, pastrina. Working in such bakeries, especially for slave bakers, was incredibly hard and dangerous. Although it seems that baking bread is a fairly peaceful activity, in the conditions of ancient Rome, it turned into a real torture. What made this work so brutal if the final product was so important to the city's life? Bakeries in ancient Rome, especially large ones, were not just rooms with ovens, but entire production complexes, where everything was subordinated to a continuous baking cycle. The main source of cruelty was precisely continuous production and the lack of any mechanization. Continuous work 24 hours a day meant that bakers worked in constant, sweltering heat. Huge stone ovens, heated to the limit, worked continuously 24 hours a day, which led to the fact that the temperature in the bakeries could reach unbearable values, especially in the summer. Imagine working in a stuffy environment where even the air burns your lungs and sweat pours down in torrents, causing constant dehydration. Slaves manually kneaded huge amounts of dough, which required colossal physical strength and endurance. In the absence of electric mixers, this task was performed with bare hands or using primitive tools resembling large pestles, which were driven by human power and sometimes even by donkeys. Then this dough had to be cut up, formed into bread, and transferred to hot ovens using long wooden shovels. The process was fraught with risks. Burns from hot stoves, steam, and boiling oil were common. Any mistake could result in serious injury and sometimes death. The air in the bakeries was saturated with flour dust, which caused serious lung diseases in workers. Many suffered from chronic coughs, asthma, and other respiratory problems such as silicosis. In addition, constant exposure to heat and heavy physical labor led to dehydration, exhaustion, and heat stroke. The work shifts were grueling, often 12 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. Slave bakers rarely lived to old age, and their bodies were marked with burn scars and signs of chronic illnesses. In addition to physical suffering, bakers, like many other slaves, were subjected to constant surveillance and punishment. Any delay in work, poor quality product, or attempt to rest was punishable by lashings or other physical violence. The life of a baker was a closed circle of labor and suffering, devoid of any prospects. Their work was critical to the city's food supply, but they were just faceless cogs in a giant machine, doomed to slowly fade away in the hot, dusty hell of the bakery. Their bodies, gaunt and scarred, were living proof of the brutality of the Roman system, which valued food above human life. Do you think that slave bakers, working side by side in such close quarters and heat, could have started secret, possibly same-sex relationships? And how did Roman society react to such liberties? The answer is in the next paragraph, and it will surprise you. Meat consumption in ancient Rome was huge, especially in the cities. The work of a butcher, or lanius, was physically very hard, dirty, and cruel, especially for those who were slaves or members of the lower strata of society. Butchers didn't just carve up the carcasses, they were responsible for the entire process, from slaughtering the animals to preparing them for sale. How insensitive did one have to be to practice this bloody craft on a daily basis? This profession required not just strength, but also psychological resistance to constant violence and blood. The work began with the slaughter of animals, cattle, pigs, sheep, poultry. This required not only physical strength, but also a certain cruelty and complete lack of sensitivity to the suffering of living beings. Slaughtering often took place in unhygienic conditions, which led to the spread of diseases among workers and potentially among consumers. Meat markets, macella, were noisy, dirty, and stinking places where death was a daily occurrence. The slaughter was followed by the laborious and dirty work of butchering the carcasses, skinning, removing the entrails, and dismemberment. All this was done by hand, using sharp knives and axes, which led to frequent cuts and wounds that were easily infected in an unsanitary environment. The lack of antiseptics and basic hygiene meant that even a small cut could lead to serious infection, blood poisoning, and even death. The butchers worked in constant contact with blood, entrails, and animal waste. The smell in the butcher shops was unbearable, attracting flies and rats, further adding to the unsanitary conditions and the risk of infection. Constant standing, lifting and moving heavy carcasses, as well as the need to work with sharp tools in crowded conditions, led to chronic back pain, joint pain, injuries, and infections. Hygiene was minimal, and most butchers suffered from skin diseases and parasites, which made their bodies a hotbed of disease. The social stigma associated with this profession was significant. Butchers who smelled of blood and dirt were often considered low-class people who were shunned in the more pure Roman society. Their labor, while absolutely necessary to provide the city with food, also made them outcasts, symbolizing an unacceptable level of cruelty and pollution for many. Their lives were difficult, filled with physical suffering and social ostracism, which made this profession one of the most undesirable in Rome. Could the constant proximity to death and violence have given butchers, or those who controlled them, peculiar, perverse forms of relationships? And what did Roman laws say about this? Find out the answer that shocks you. Watch this video to the end. Roman cities were huge and constantly required the movement of goods, building materials, and the dead. The work of a porter, especially a sarcophagus, a person who transported the dead, was one of the most humiliating, dirty, and physically exhausting. In the era of lack of developed transport and mechanisms, most of the heavy loads moved on the backs of people. Why was this work, if it was so disgusting, performed by such specific people and not by ordinary slaves? The profession of a sarcophagus involved direct contact with death and decay. These people, often slaves or the poorest strata of the population, were engaged in carrying the bodies of the deceased to burial sites outside the city. This was especially difficult during the hot season, when the bodies quickly decomposed, giving off an unbearable stench. Sarcophagi were supposed to carry bodies that might already be in a state of decomposition, often without proper packaging or in primitive stretchers, across the city. This work caused disgust and fear among other citizens, making porters outcasts. Society tried to distance itself from everything connected with death and decay, and those who did this on a daily basis became the object of neglect. The reason why these specific people, rather than ordinary slaves, did this work lies in social hierarchy and contempt. Even among the slaves, there was a hierarchy, and the least valuable, the most disenfranchised and rejected, were assigned to the dirtiest and most humiliating jobs. It was a job that everyone who could avoid, and those who had no other choice or were already branded by society were assigned to it. In addition to carrying the bodies, many porters were also engaged in moving heavy loads. Building materials, amphorae with wine or oil, barrels, wood. They constantly carried huge weights, which led to spinal injuries, hernias, and chronic pain in the joints and muscles. They worked under the scorching sun or in the cold, without adequate food and rest. Every day, their bodies were subjected to excessive loads, which led to premature wear and tear of the body. The porter's life was hard and cramped, full of illness and physical suffering. Their bodies, worn out and crippled by overwork, were a testament to how ruthless working life could be in Greater Rome, where human strength was used to the point of exhaustion, and human dignity was only the privilege of a few. This profession was literally a gravedigger of the living, taking away their health and life itself. But what happened to these gravediggers of the living when their own bodies refused to serve? And how did the Roman Empire, so great in its achievements, treat those who were driven to the extreme of exhaustion? The answer is in the next final point, and it will be harsh. This job wasn't physically grueling in the same sense as the previous ones, but it was one of the most morally debilitating and violent in ancient Rome. Slave drivers, or virators, were overseers who supervised the work of slaves on plantations, mines, construction sites, and other places where mass forced labor was required. Their function was to maintain discipline, maximize productivity, and punish the slightest disobedience or slow down mercilessly. Could these people sleep at night knowing that their job was to constantly hurt others? Virators' role was key to maintaining the slave system. They were the link between the slave owner and the slaves, embodying the power and cruelty of the master. Virators were armed with whips, sticks, whips, and other instruments of punishment. Their job was to put constant physical and psychological pressure on the slaves. Not only did they beat those who worked slowly, but they could also use sophisticated torture, deprive them of food and water, and separate slave families as punishment. Their authority was absolute, and their brutality was boundless, as it was encouraged by slave owners who demanded maximum returns from their slaves. Virators were often former slaves who were promoted to taskmasters for their loyalty and cruelty. This created an even more cynical system, where yesterday's victims became tormentors. This position gave them some power and privileges, but it also made them outcasts among both freemen and slaves who despised them. Moral corruption was inevitable. The daily infliction of pain, the observation of suffering, the deprivation of people's dignity turned virators into soulless executioners. In addition to physical violence, virators may have used other forms of pressure, including sexual violence. In Roman society, slaves had no rights, and their bodies were the property of the master. Virators, having almost unlimited power over slaves, could force them to have sexual relations with both women and men. These acts of violence were part of a system of suppression and humiliation, further blurring the line between man and thing. Virators lived under constant strain, fearing retribution from the slaves or the wrath of the master if productivity declined. Their lives, while more comfortable than those of ordinary slaves, were filled with fear and psychological pressure. They were a living reflection of the brutality of the Roman system, which not only exploited human labor, but also corrupted the souls of both the oppressed and the oppressors. We went through 10 of the most brutal professions in ancient Rome, looking behind the scenes of the empire's greatness and seeing its dark, merciless face. From the life-grinding mines and bloody arenas of the Colosseum to the fetid laundries and sewer tunnels, each of these jobs was a real torture, where human life was valued no more than consumables. We saw how the system of slavery not only exploited bodies, but also destroyed souls, blurring the line between man and thing. We hope that this immersion in the brutal reality of ancient Rome has changed your understanding of this civilization. If you want to learn even more about the dark sides of history and the shocking facts that hide behind the shiny facades, be sure to subscribe to our channel and put a like. What other aspects of life in ancient Rome would you like to explore? Write your thoughts and questions in the comments. We are always interested in your opinion.